Well, dramatic developments this weekend out of Venezuela. The U.S. launched a surprise military operation that led to the capture of President Nicolás Maduro and his wife. They're now in U.S. custody, and in just a few hours, they will be arraigned in court on federal charges. President Trump says Venezuela will be run temporarily by the U.S. during a transition, and he's issued a sharp warning to Venezuela's vice president, saying she could, quote, pay a very big price if she doesn't cooperate. To help us understand the legal, historical, and geopolitical stakes of this moment, we're joined by political analyst Anita Manion. We've seen her on our airwaves this morning, so thanks for joining us. And thanks for definitely being here, because I think there's a lot of questions surrounding this. So we know you're the best person for it.
Thank you.
So just first off, the legal authority for this strike wasn't really immediately clear. And reports actually note that they didn't know if Congress was consulted in this beforehand. So from a constitutional and also just international law standpoint, can a U.S. president order an operation like this?
So the argument that Marco Rubio and the Trump administration are making is that this was not necessarily a military operation. This is a law enforcement operation, basically to execute this warrant, this indictment, and they use the military to help do that because it's in a hostile territory. Now, a lot of people are taking that with a big grain of salt and saying, you know, these were military troops going in to do this, and the fact that President Trump has said that the U.S. will be running Venezuela seems to indicate it's a longer ongoing operation than just sort of swooping in and grabbing someone to bring them to trial.
Definitely, and we'll get to the part about the U.S. potentially temporarily running Venezuela in a minute. We also want to ask, though, this operation obviously involved, as you mentioned, U.S. airstrikes on Venezuelan air defenses and special forces actually taking Maduro from his compound. Has the U.S. or any other country ever carried something like this out?
This is highly unusual. For one thing, when we talk about international law, there is basically immunity for heads of state under the UN Charter. And so a lot of people would argue, and I'm sure that Maduro is going to argue, that this was an illegal action to take him. And so that same argument was made by Manuel Noriega in the 1980s when President H.W. Bush brought him to trial. Now, he was sort of installed in a coup and was less of a legitimate leader, even though we didn't acknowledge Maduro's election. It was largely fraudulent. He was installed as the head of state, so that's an argument he's going to make.
Yeah, definitely something that a lot of people are talking about was if this ever has been done and if it's constitutionally okay at this point. So the Monroe Doctrine is nearly 200 years old, but it's suddenly kind of front and center again throughout all this. Can you explain why this doctrine is being invoked now and how it shapes U.S. claims of authority or even influence in Latin America?
Yeah, so we're talking about a doctrine that goes back to the 1830s, but you know, everything old is new again, right? And so the Monroe Doctrine was sort of this idea that we will stay out of European issues, but we want Europe to stay out of the Americas, to stop colonizing, and sort of this is an influence sphere of the United States. And then that was expanded under other presidents to sort of say, not only should you stay out of it, but that we have the right to sort of be in charge in the Americas. And then President Trump is sort of expanding that to what he's called the Monroe Doctrine, right? And this idea that he said, we will have dominance over the Americas. And so I think that perks up a lot of people's ears. What does that mean about America's level of involvement? A lot of people are having flashbacks to Afghanistan and Iraq and concerns about the cost and American lives that could be involved.
And you mentioned earlier about President Trump saying the U.S. is going to temporarily take over Venezuela, and also what he said to the vice president. What do you think happens next? Can we really take over and control Venezuela right now?
It's a really good question. And some people, you know, of course, are asking in this power vacuum, should it be the vice president who is part of the Maduro administration assuming power, or should it be the person that most people claim rightfully won the election? Should they be assuming power? There's going to be lots of factions fighting for this. And so it's not going to be simple. That is one thing we know. The U.S. has actually conducted war games about a power vacuum in Venezuela and what that would look like. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't simple. And so I think what a lot of people are worried about is not just, you know, that we executed this, but what is our exit strategy and how will the U.S. not be just sucked into a Venezuelan long time. Yeah.
Right. And given the scale of this initial operation, do you think the U.S. is preparing for any additional military action?
That's a good question. You know, the president has said that, you know, if the vice president doesn't cooperate, she could have worse implications than Maduro did. So what does that mean? Additional military involvement. And he also said, you know, he would be open to maybe involvement in Colombia. We have lots of troops in the region. So this is something that many people are watching closely.
And I know we'll hear a lot of updates throughout the day. Do we know when we may see something new? I know you've gotten it all. You're probably watching it every single second. But I guess for me, the big question is, when will we know any next steps? Or is that a hard question to answer?
I think it is a hard question. And back to your original discussion about the role of Congress, you know, about 2/3 of Americans say that Congress should have been consulted in this. And when it comes to what political leaders are saying, of course, it's largely divided among party lines, but 94% of Americans say that Venezuelans should decide who's in charge of their country, not America.
Wow. Thank you so much. It's definitely one of those topics that's so hard for all of us to grasp, especially if people are just getting the headlines.
Yeah.
So you explaining it and kind of doing it like Reader's Digest version is really, really great. Thank you so much,
Happy to
Anita
help.
Manion, for helping us break down this fast-moving and historic situation. And as the world watches to see what comes next for Venezuela, we'll continue following the U.S. response, the regional reaction, and what this means for the millions of people living through this transition.